Welcome to the Mercy Cast, where we are learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I am your host, Raleigh Sadler. You know those moments when life feels unmanageable, everything's out of control. No matter what you do, you feel isolated and alone because everything has gone haywire. I may be speaking to the choir today, because if you're listening to this podcast, you know that life doesn't always give you roses. It doesn't always do what you expect out of it. Sometimes the American dream is a nightmare. Sometimes the things that we hoped for fail. Sometimes the people that we thought we could depend on are nowhere to be found. 2 years ago, Anita's household was doing seemingly well until her husband comes home and announces that he wants to leave. At this point, life went sideways for Anita and her family. And this was just the beginning. Anita Anello is the author of 6-Step Blueprint to Build a Profitable Business and the CEO of Ripple Effect, which helps corporate women of faith to transition from the corporate world to the entrepreneurial world. Anita, welcome to the Mercy Cast.
Thanks, Riley. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're here because this is a conversation worth having. It's so easy to talk a big game and to talk about community and to talk up all the friends that we say we have. But there's that old phrase that when we go through something, we find out who our friends are. We find out who we can depend on. We find out who's going to answer the phone at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
And not be upset. Because these days, a lot of people will just set their phone to silent mode. They're not going to hear you anyway. But I remember a day where a lot of people, they had to face that. If someone's going to call me at 3 a.m., will I pick up the phone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
And so your husband comes home and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're blindsided in this moment.
I was. I mean, I look at the time of him saying, "Hey, I'm really done." It was a shock, not because of not because of the words that were coming out of his mouth, because we've always loved each other, but we weren't really in a season of liking one another. Things were challenging and not really getting resolved. I think the shock part for me was it was a conversation that happened in front of our kids, and there's no, let me just be clear. There's no shame there towards my husband or anything like that. Like, we've resolved these things, but he was at a breaking point in his life for a lot of different reasons. And the way that it worked itself out is he and I just kind of just exploded right in the midst of that. And it was the first time that had ever happened for us. The first and only time it ever happened, right in front of our kids.
Well, it sounds like a real relationship, because I think we can talk about the idea of being in love with the idea of love. But when you actually love another person, whether this is romantic or it is a friendship, you're choosing to love that whole person in their good seasons and in their bad seasons.
Yeah.
And the thing is I have found nothing is as simple as one story. Oftentimes, the things that lead up to things are very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I appreciate how you say that about your husband, how there were a lot of things going on, because of course, I mean, you don't get to these moments, you don't hit these walls unless there is, I don't want to use the word dysfunction, but unless not everything is working the way it should be.
Yeah.
And so you hit this wall, you're dealing with the shock. Tell us what happened immediately after.
So in the midst of that situation, because it was such a big blow up, and it was right before Easter weekend 2 years ago, the kids and I we were rattled. We were immediately just in shock. A couple of key things happened. I had called, so we have 2 kids still at home, and our oldest is my stepson, a little bit older, and lives in a different city. So I had called him and was able to have him do some intervention for me, which was super helpful. I was like, "Hey, Dad, this is what's going on. This is where Dad's at. I either need you to come down here or take him, something," because we were at a spot for my husband and I, we couldn't have conversations. It was too intense. And my younger kids, right, they were just oh my gosh, they were like deer in the headlights. They weren't really sure. as we started walking through the process, we went from, I kind of tried to remove him from the situation and just, we were all walking around pretty numb, but kind of going through the motions of, all right, how do I just physically get us to move around and all this kind of stuff. And then the next like 24 hours was really interesting because for me, I went from shock to sadness to I'm going to figure this out because I had already had, and here's what was kind of cool. I remember going to my kids the next day and looking at them and saying, and by that time, my husband had left the house. He'd gone to stay with my stepson for a couple of days so that we could just all have some breathing room to figure some things out. And in the midst of that, I remember waking up the next day after again going from like shock to crying to being able to say like, okay, I'm going to figure this out no matter what it takes. So I looked at both of my younger kids and I had said, hey, here's the scoop. I'm not sure, like dad's got to figure out his own stuff. Like that's dad's responsibility. It's not my responsibility to figure that out for him. But what I do know is we're going to be okay no matter what. God's in this with us and we are going to be okay. And there was a radical shift. I could see like the countenance on my kids' faces had changed and they were teenagers, but very young teenagers at the time. And as I looked at them and I'd said, we're going to be okay. I'm going to figure this out. Like their whole face shifted because I had already had the habit of being the mom that shows up that says, if mommy says something's going to change, we can trust her that it's going to change. And so when I looked at them and said, dad's got to figure out his stuff. We're going to figure out some things, but no matter what, we're going to be okay. They were like, oh, okay, I trust mom because I've heard her say these words before and I know that it's always turned out okay. And so there was this habit, this pattern, this ability for me as a person of integrity to show up and say, we're going to figure this out. And so that relieved a whole bunch of pressure for my kids. And for me as a mom, once I noticed that they were able to kind of like settle down, now we're still kind of in the midst of it. Like it's not like everything's amazing right now, but once they're able to settle down, then I could kind of get to a spot in my own mind, like, okay, now I can get to work and figure this out. Like, what's this going to look like? So then we kind of get to the end of the weekend. Things are really pretty intense. Several days go by. My husband comes back in the house and we start reaching out to just get some help. Actually, at the onset of the upset, we had reached out to our pastors and friends and people closest to us in our church family. It was kind of an interesting thing. I mean, when you go through adversity, sometimes you have some people, not a lot, but you have a few people, hopefully, that'll dive in and say, wow, that's hard. Let me walk through it with you. Most people were like, whoa, like that's intense. Oh my gosh, marriage stuff. We can't take sides, all that kind of stuff. And I was like, what do you mean you can't take sides? Like, I'm telling you, this is what's going on. You say that you love both my husband and I all the time. Like, what's happening? So there was a lot of kind of like scatter. Then there were a very few who stepped in and said, we will help you. We will help you get into counseling. We will help you navigate the re-entry. We will help you navigate the next steps. We will help you navigate the conversation. And when I say a few, there's one couple in particular that was like, I know this is hard. I know this totally sucks, but we will walk through this with you. And I mean, they were there in the midst of like coming back together and having like the initial conversations. They were there when husband and I couldn't really say much to one another because there was so much stuff that was so raw still. But sitting at lunch with this other husband and he and his wife and I had already talked over this time frame. And as soon as I see him, like, poof, just tears come running down my face. And he would say things like, Anita, I can see that there's a lot of woundedness here. But we're going to figure it out. We're going to help you kind of walk through that process. And just, sometimes more than anything, you don't need anybody to really say anything. You just need somebody to say, I see you. I see that this is hard. And I'm just going to stand here and hug you until you're, stop like having your whole face fall drain down onto the floor and that kind of stuff. And so, I mean, I'm so grateful for the few people that were able to be able to walk through that part of us. And then we'll get kind of to the next part of the story there.
Well, and Anita, what does it feel like to bring this up? I'm sure you talk about it,
Yeah.
but what does it feel like to kind of bring this up afresh in another setting now that you're on the other side of it?
It's hard because there are still elements of the experience that are really raw and not painful in the sense of like I'm reliving them. But anytime you have a close relationship that is so close to your heart, so full of intimacy, so full of hope, so
Yeah.
full of raw, wow, this is hard, but it's also good. And, being on the other side of it and being able to say, like, God has done such a mighty work in our marriage. It's really pretty incredible. And while I would not have wanted it to happen that way, I'm grateful for being on the other side. But it's like anything that is that hard and that raw, like radical, where you look back and you're like, oh, wow, that's that's a little bit painful to even talk about. And I don't, it's not that I mind talking about it. It's just that as I picture in my mind these things that were going on, the words that my husband was saying, caring for my kids, distinctly remembering how in the heck am I going to figure this out? At that time, my husband was the primary breadwinner in our household. And I was like in between two businesses. One was in the process of closing down and one that was just launching. And so financially, I was in a very different place of like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I just said I'm going to take care of my kids, but how am I going to do that? Because I did not have income in my business and I had already retired from my corporate job. And so it was this weird place for me financially, thinking like, oh, shoot, how am I going to figure this out? And so those are the pieces that are just like, ooh, yeah, kind of brings up those emotions in a way that is good and healthy and hard all at the same time.
When you mentioned earlier that when you got that news, that you felt shock and sadness,
Mhm.
and then you went into solution mode.
Yeah.
You're like, we're going to figure this out. And you sat your kids down and you said, your dad has stuff he needs to sort out. We have stuff we need to sort out, but we will. We're
Mhm.
going to get there. And as you were telling the story about the people that actually did stick by your side, because sometimes when we're going through a lot, that can be a lot for other people. And I
Yeah.
and I can understand that. And sometimes people aren't necessarily prepared. They are really good at being like good time Charlies to
Yeah.
where they go out and you have a fun time. You're living life.
Yeah.
But and I like to say this, when the defecation hits the ventilation, do they want to sit around? Do they want to sit in it with you? Because that's not a fun place to be.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that because I've had a lot of opportunities to reflect on this, and I could say, "Oh my gosh, it's so awful that, folks closest to me, my church family that said it was my family, that they didn't react in the way that I needed it to them." But actually, I feel like the Holy Spirit has shown me a completely different side of that. And
Yeah.
where I've come to settle on is not everybody's always equipped to walk through like the muck and the mire and the hard stuff of life. And that's okay. Because here's the thing, because not everybody's equipped to walk through kind of that hard, gnarly parts of life, what ends up happening is they kind of take a step back because they just don't know what to say. They don't know what to say. And so then therefore they kind of say nothing or, kind of like the, oh gosh, that's so hard, little pat on the back, but I'm going to be over here. And I don't think it's ever I choose to believe that it's not necessarily out of like malice or anything like that. But the other part of it is just really hard to deal with on top of their own stuff. And so I don't know. I've kind of released a lot of people from feeling like it was their responsibility or I should be upset with anybody. I mean, it's a bummer, but I also feel like we had God on our side. We had each other, and we did have a few couple of people that were really close to us that were willing to walk through the junk with us. And really looking back, that's all I needed. I just needed the little bit, like the tiny little circle around my kids and I to be able to say, we're going to figure this out. Part of me, part of my personality style is like I'm a go getter. I love to put plans into action and get stuff done. So going through the process of like shock and grief and then like, oh, now I got to figure something out. Like that process happened very quickly for me because that's kind of how I operate. And given an emergency, like I'm the first one probably in my household to be like, let's figure this out. We're going to, whatever the emergency is. So that when I say it that way and I say that it happened that quickly, that's genuine. And it's also because that's how God's made me. And so I'm kind of like a problem solver by nature. And especially like the more adversity that comes my way, the faster I can solve problems. And so that was one of those things. Like when I say my kids already trusted when mommy said, hey, we're going to be okay, it's because I had already modeled that for them for years and years and years ahead of time.
I like to tell people that when faced with adversity, we can do one of three things. The first thing is nothing,
Mhm.
because oftentimes we haven't thought through, like you said, we're not equipped. I think that's a really good and gracious way of viewing that rather than saying, these people don't love me. They
No.
don't care. They may not care. They may not love you. That may be the truth, but it may not be. They may just not know. They may also not be in touch with their vulnerability. So when they
Mhm.
see your vulnerability, it reminds them of their own mortality. And all of a sudden, they want to be anywhere but there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes you just don't have a plan. You've never seen it modeled. You just don't know what to do. When I was starting out as a pastor, I remember people were telling us about hospital visits. And one of the first things they said was, don't sit on the bed.
I can see why. Yeah. Yeah.
Don't sit on the bed, because you get in there and you're like, but you learn over time that you're really just dealing with humans.
Yeah.
And that whole do unto others as you would have done to you, that can be a helpful guide.
Mhm.
But still, it's very easy in those moments to feel paralyzed
Mhm.
or to feel like that person is too much. I already have my own stuff.
Mhm.
Sometimes people don't help us because of their own boundaries. I had to tell someone, I can't help you.
Mhm.
I don't know if I told him that right away. I think I told him a little later, but it was more like I had so much on my plate that I knew that if I couldn't bring that person's burdens onto my shoulders, I could be a friend, but that's
Mhm.
all I could be.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's like, I can't solve this problem, but I can listen.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we do nothing because we don't know that sometimes all that person wants is just you to be in the room.
Mhm.
And so they don't feel as isolated as they're tempted to feel. And so there's that idea of doing nothing. And then the other side is you do the first thing that comes to mind, which I've found to be generally the worst thing that you could ever do, ever.
What is
It's
that?
that thing where you just react.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And you're just like, okay, here we go. We're going to solve this. We're going to fix it. I'm going to go talk to him right now, or I'm going to talk to her right now, or
Yeah.
we're going to take a breather.
Yeah.
Just be present. We don't need to solve these things that fast. And I think the best option is just to do something and just take a step, a tiny step.
Mhm.
But you found really quickly, and again, I love how you can graciously see the people who didn't necessarily meet you in that moment.
Yeah.
And you could see that there were other things going on. But you did. When you were describing the people who sat with you in it, I could tell like there was an emotion there. Like
Oh,
even
yeah.
you've probably shared this story a bunch, but in that moment, you're still connecting with something that was special. What set those people apart? You talk about the other people not being equipped. How were these people equipped for that moment?
I think being willing to just sit with us and like for me in that moment, sit with me and just let me cry until I was done. Not having to solve anything for me, not having to be there, step in any way. And then the next step was stepping into a conversation with my husband and I and being able to say, hey, Anita, I know you.
Yeah.
These are some of the things that I've watched you do that probably need some improvement. These are that are probably I've talked to your husband already. These are some of the things that he's talking about. Then the same thing for my husband. Hey, I know you. These are some of the things that are really hard for Anita and that need to be addressed. So being able to almost like step in and have those conversations that we were having, but not having very successfully. And we stopped listening to one another. We stopped really paying attention. We were there for one another in some ways, but not, where there had been some stacking on of wounds, shall we say. It was kind of like, oh, now I don't want to hear anything you have to say. So sometimes just having a person in the midst to be able to say, this is what I hear she's saying, this is what I hear he's saying. Can you guys hear that, at least for me? Then being able to say, hey, we're going to step in and walk through this process and get you guys connected with a counselor and somebody who's really licensed and equipped to do that kind of stuff. So they just took us like to the next step. And then the bigger step was, all right, let's really start unpacking why it is that what got us to this spot, and then how do we repair that? And so we did that. We walked through several weeks, several months actually of counseling and kind of getting back to that spot of listening to one another better, understanding the needs and the wants that were there and the wounds and the hurts and we kind of my husband and I both came to the table and we both had kind of our list of like, these things can never happen again. These are my no's. And so we're never going back there for some of that stuff. And being able to have a person there really shepherding us through the process of having conversation and learning how to love one another again and speak to each other again in a way that was honoring and respectful and kind. And to be fair, like, it's not that we had stopped doing those things altogether. We just had gotten ourselves to a spot where we weren't as healthy as we needed to be, which is interesting because that actually prepared us for the next big bomb that dropped in our household, which is where we went next. So this whole thing, just kind of keep in context, this is like in about a 6 to 8 week time frame. We went from marriage crisis to a medical emergency. My husband, weeks later, went in for a normal routine outpatient procedure, and within about an hour ended up in the emergency room and then ended up in the cardiac wing. And man, I thought that the prior, I don't remember how long it was, 4 to 6 week season was pretty hard, but that really rocked us, because the reality is that if it were not for that outpatient procedure and getting him over to the emergency room within that quick time period and getting him the immediate assistance that he needed because his heart was not performing well, that was actually life-saving for him. And so that brings back a whole lot of emotions, because the reality is we can look at each other and having walked through a medical crisis on top of that and be like, wow, there's a very real chance that he wouldn't be here today. And so walking through the process of having the doctors tell us, hey, this is what your heart's doing, this is what it needs to do, this is what we've tried, this is what's working, this is what's not working, and all that kind of stuff. And to be honest, and we've talked about this a lot, I remember dropping him off for the outpatient procedure that day. And I drove him over there because, when you're going to go under anesthesia, you can't drive yourself there and back, that kind of stuff.
Right.
So I remember dropping Vince off and thinking we had been repairing our marriage in a lot of ways, but there was still a lot of rawness. There was still a lot of stuff that we were working through. And in the midst of that, I remember dropping him off like, okay, as soon as he gets settled with the doctors and the nurses, like, I got to go take care of something. I'm going to go do some work or something like that. Like, I just needed a little bit of space, and I was okay just saying, all right, I'll see you in about 4 hours. Like, I'm good. And not in a way like we were arguing or anything like that anymore, but there was still, again, because there was still like this rawness in between us and this thing where we were still in the process of healing, there was a lot of like, all right, I'll see you later. So to get a call from the nurse and the outpatient procedure and get a call from the doctor who had said to me, so sweet, and he was like, Mrs. Anello, can you make sure and like be really safe, but hurry back here. You know, like I'm in the car halfway home and the doctor and the nurse are calling me saying he's got to go to see a cardiologist right now. And we've already called over to the emergency room and he said he doesn't want to take an ambulance. And can you come back and get him to take him over there right now? So yeah, let me pause right there because that's a lot of information.
Well, and as you were describing your friends who came alongside of you in that really dark, tough moment,
Yeah.
you described people that they were equipped, but they were equipped with things that we can all grow in. They weren't necessarily equipped with doctorate degrees and we can get those too, but they used the tools that were at their disposal. They listened, they allowed you to be who you were in that moment, and
Hmm.
they helped you take a step. They didn't try to solve it for you,
Yeah.
but because of their knowledge of both of you, they were able to say, hey, sometimes this happens and you do this. Sometimes you do that, or he does this, he does
Hmm.
that. And they pointed you to a counselor who could go in more depth so that they could continue to be friends and walk with you. But they also understood that they weren't equipped to do everything, that there were people who were more equipped who could help you. But then
Absolutely.
you pivoted. You
Hmm.
pivoted there because we're talking about how community comes alongside of us. And it's like you got a snapshot of what could be because here you are, you're working through a really hard thing. And sometimes when we're in the hard thing, we think that that's it. And once we get through that, we'll be fine. But what I've found is sometimes the adversity that we face is helping us grow so that when we face more adversity,
Hmm.
we will react differently than we would have had we not faced adversity to begin
Hmm.
with.
Yeah.
And so you and your husband had really done a lot of work, and your family had done a lot of work, and you were on a path to healing, albeit raw. There was almost like a divine surgery happening in your relationship. So when your husband has to go to the cardiac ward, and even at that point, you admitted, I was still a little raw, just kind of wanted to go home. I needed some space. I wanted to go home. I wanted to watch my stories. I wanted to zone out for a little bit and then return to the work. But then all of a sudden you find out this could all end.
Hmm.
And then I would assume you got back rather speedily
Hmm.
and you wound up there. You were by your husband's side. Tell me more about what happened after that.
I guess I'd say a lot's changed in the emergency room environment since COVID. So
Yes.
it's different. It's very different. There's different protocols now, who can go in, who could not go in, all that kind of stuff. I dropped him at the front door of the emergency room so that he could walk right in and not mess around with trying to park or anything like that. And so he gets inside the emergency room, they get him checked in, then I get up to the front counter and the attendant was like, "Yeah, he's here." And just like perfect gatekeeper in that environment, doing exactly the job that this young man was trained to do and all that kind of stuff. But for me, like standing there waiting was very difficult. So some time goes by. They finally let me back in to see him. And when I say he was really out of it, they'd already started giving him some medication to try to get his heart rate under control, and it wasn't working. I mean, to be honest, like they gave him lots of the emergency room doctors and everything. They were all amazing, but nothing was responding in his heart. And so it was medication after medication after medication. And
Wow.
he was really out of it. He would say things like, I want to go home. We got to go home. And I was like, you're not going home. Like, there's no way. Right. And so they're trying medication. They're trying different things that they know how to do acutely in the emergency room to try to get his heart out of what he was in, what's called AFib. So that's atrial fibrillation, where the heart does not operate
I
in
know it well.
on a regular rhythm. And his heart would not respond. It would drop down. His heart rate would drop and it seemed like it would be normal. And then it would shoot right back up all within like minutes. And so
Yeah.
what was interesting is that I'll try to do the eye contact. So the doctors and nurses, I would be standing over here and they would be looking right at the monitor and they'd be talking to me, talking to me, talking to me. But all they were doing was watching his heart rate go bounce down and then bounce right back up. And it was kind of like, hey, but I mean, they were just giving him the 100% care that he needed. So the hours go by in the emergency room. And I mean, that's hard because the ER, it's just intense. It's cold. You're not really sure what's going on. You're trying to get, there's a lot of waiting, but you're trying to get information kind of all at the same time. We kind of get towards and again, I'm texting all of our people. Now this time is interesting because they had walked through the process with us as best as they could. So some a little bit more arm's distance, some a little bit more right in the thick of things. But there was a lot of like, is there anything we can do? Can we pray? And again, some people were more able to help than others. No judgment, no nothing. I was grateful just to be able to have people that as I texted them, they would say, we're going to keep praying. So having a body of Christ around us that could say, there's nothing really you can do right now, but can you just pray for us? Later on in the day, it was like, can you go over and reach out to my kids? Can you do things for me? I feel like at that season, I was probably maybe a little bit better equipped to actually ask for real things because I'm not really good at saying, you know what, I could use dinner tonight. You know what, can you go and send like I had one friend and she was so sweet. She's like, Anita, I'm going to send a housekeeper over to your house, because my husband's in the hospital for a week. And I was like, wow, okay, thanks. Like you're absolutely right. I totally need somebody to clean my house right now because I can't function. I can't do those kinds of things. So mostly what I remember is I remember the look on my husband's face and how he just was very unaware of what was actually happening. And then I remember a lot of the comments that he would make and things like I said earlier, like, let's just go home. I'm ready to go home. And I'm like, oh no, like that's not happening. And then the doctors were telling me over many hours, like, he's got to get checked into the cardiac wing. Like he can't go home yet. So I'm getting all these different inputs. And then I'm kind of feeling with my own emotions and thinking like, oh my gosh, there's nothing like a medical crisis and pretty close to death to kind of reset your expectations. We say that in our household. So we get him checked into the cardiac area. And I do remember saying this to him over and over again, honey, I can't take care of you at home. And right now you need 24-hour care. And I was like, you have to stay over. Like, I can't take care of you this way. This is what's happening. And finally he was like, oh, I mean, okay, right. Still having a hard time processing what was happening. Come to find out later, he would tell me that actually he doesn't remember most of his time in the emergency room. And I don't know, some of his time in the cardiac area. He just was he had a hard time really connecting to what the reality of what the situation was until later. I would fill in some gaps for him later.
Did they have to cardiovert him? Like shock his heart back into rhythm?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yes. He's now had that done multiple times. Mm-hmm.
People who haven't experienced AFib, and I don't wish it on anyone, but people who haven't experienced it, they don't know that your heart goes from 70 beats a minute to 200 beats per minute.
Yeah.
And if it stays there for more than 3 days, you're likely to have a stroke.
Yeah.
But when you are in AFib, it's like you are running a marathon, but you're sitting still. There are moments where you will lose things because you're like, what just happened? Or
yeah,
people may see you and they're like, are you okay? And then you're like frantic, but the mere fact that happened following the work that you did, I would assume you were prepared in a sense for that, because I'm sure that was very scary. That sounds very scary.
Yeah.
It's scary for him and you.
It was also hard to be able to share with like our pastors and our people that kind of had full disclosure. And then our oldest son who had a little bit less information, but a little bit more information than the younger kids. And then the younger kids, just because there's about a 4-year gap between those two, like a little bit more information, a little less information. And the reason that we did that to protect them is because It's an awful lot. So our youngest would have been 12 at the time. It's an awful lot to understand all the details at 12 years old of, you said that dad was going to go to do this thing at the doctor's office for a couple hours and then he's not home that night. And so I'm super protective as a mom anyway, but I was very cautious and protective of my own kids' hearts and being able to say with confidence, the doctors have dad's in the right spot. They're going to take care of him in a way that we cannot. And then I would say the first night was an interesting night because there was a lot of like, I'm trying to take care of my kids and my people and manage a whole bunch of stuff, come home, fall into bed for exhaustion, have a full breakdown in the middle of the night, and then wrestle with God. Like when I pray, I'm a wrestler with God. I'm super transparent, even as an individual. I like that. But if I'm upset with something that's going on, I have that kind of relationship with the Father and with the Holy Spirit, with Jesus, to be able to say, like, this isn't what you promised me. What are we talking about? Like being able to have that wrestling conversation with God.
Like a modern day psalm. Yeah.
Yeah. And a real transparent, like, God, this is painful. This is awful. Are you kidding me? We just went through this and now we're going through this. And in the meantime, there had been some interesting dynamics that had happened and just in my business that had started to kick up, and some very good positive things were coming in the business in the form of now income and taking care of our household and those kinds of things. But I remember just the way that I talk to God is like, he's a good dad. And so he's okay with my transparency and and my vulnerability. And God's totally okay with my rawness of being able to say sometimes, this isn't what we talked about. This isn't and with reverence, don't get me wrong. I know and love my Father in heaven, and I know that he can take all of me and the rawness and the realness that I am, even if other people can't take that. Like I'm really good with that. I'm settled in who I am in Christ. And so having this conversation with God from my bedroom and going into the kitchen and being like, something is going to shift. Something's going to shift in the atmosphere. And again, going back to like, God, you already promised me that we're going to have these beautiful things happening in our lives. So while I don't understand this in the natural, I don't understand the circumstances, I'm not sure what's going to happen when I go back to the hospital today. I do know that no matter what, God, you are with us and we will be all right.
Earlier, when we were talking about your friends who sat in it with you, I can guarantee you that those friends are people who've wrestled through things like this. They've wrestled through hardship. It may not have been the exact same,
Yeah.
but they have been there. They have hurt. They have been humbled. They have felt life become very unmanageable. But there were people who had been through something that came alongside of them.
Yeah.
And what I find interesting is that these people came alongside of you both to almost prepare you to stand alongside of your husband when he could barely even function because so many things were going wrong in his body.
Yeah.
And then you, as a true wrestler, you go to God and you're like, this isn't the way it should be. I don't like this. Where are you? What are we doing here?
Yeah.
Help me. Here's my fears. Here's my concerns. But I trust you to be a dad that loves me.
Yeah.
I do trust you for that. So guide me. And I find it interesting that in the two aspects of this story, you see people who've been through it and then they meet you where you are. And then you've been through it and you meet your husband where he is.
Yeah.
And I would almost wonder if that thing that maybe you all felt like was missing early on when things started getting difficult, if you didn't find something new through everything that you went through. May not have been that thing. I don't know. I'm not a marital counselor, but I've found that when we go through things, they can give us new perspective and we're able to see the people in our lives differently.
Yeah.
And it can often awaken love and care and kindness and tenderness and all of these things.
Yeah.
Am I on target at all? I don't know.
Yes. Yeah, you are. It definitely shifted my perspective towards him about, we walked through all this hard stuff. The funny thing is we were in the if I rewind a couple of hours when we were in the emergency room, I was like, we've already walked through so many hard things. What are you doing right now? Like, and I was like, I already have, like, God and I have already had that conversation that I'm making it to 100. You got to make it with me. And he's like, okay.
Right.
So he's a little bit older than me. So he's like, all right. So another, he fills in the blank, like another 40 odd years. And I was like, yes. And he's like, oh, can you make that promise to me? Like, this isn't going to be it. Come on already. And he goes, yeah, okay. So I remind him of that often when he's not feeling well or he's not taking care of himself. I was like, you promised me in the hospital that you would give me another 40 years and you and I were going to get to 100, even though even though I'm younger than you, you said you'd make it to 100. And so we've had a lot of fun with it, but there's also it's just a resetting of the priorities. Now, I don't think you have to have those things happen in your life for your priorities to reset. I don't think you necessarily, I would dare say that you might not want those things to happen. You might not want some of the things that have happened to me. I would say this, and this is kind of highly, as we've been speaking, one of the things that I hadn't considered before that I feel like I'm seeing in a whole new way. While it's wonderful to have either a tiny little group of people or a bigger group or whatever that looks like for you in your life, whoever's listening, even if it's just one person, while it's wonderful and we need that, we need people. God made us to be people in community. We absolutely need one another. That's, there's the Trinity that models that for us. Like that's right. There's all great things around us.
Right.
However, I also wonder as we're talking here, and this is kind of what I've been maybe pondering for a while, like it's great to have the person that'll walk with me shoulder to shoulder, but my goodness, isn't some of the benefit of some of the we see God's mercies and God's grace later when we look back and go, God, you were the one that was right there with me.
There it is.
You sent somebody in this body to nurture me, care for me. God, that was really you speaking through that person to help me, because don't you want to mature me up? Aren't the trials there to grow and mature me as the son and the daughter of the Most High King? Isn't that part of? Now, God does not, there's nowhere in scripture that says God brings the wrath or brings the bad in our life. God's good all the time. So I just want to set the stage on that. However, when the hard stuff comes, God will use it for his glory and for our good, because he's a good dad. He loves us. He wants us to grow. He doesn't want us to stay babies having the milk. He wants us to dig in and have the meat, and the meat comes and the faith grows and the maturity comes when we actually walk through the trials. So I do know that as a household, all of us, all four of us, we all can stand up confidently and say, man, that sucked. But we have matured, we have grown, we have kind of grown closer together. We've grown closer to the Godhead. We've grown closer to depending on God. I know that no matter what the outcome, you're here with us. And we trust you that you're going to walk through this thing with us. So that's where I can stand on this side of that adversity, because I know something else is going to come up. I'm not declaring that over myself. I just happen to know how life works, and I know what scripture says. Scripture says there's going to be more trials, right? Yeah. But I also know that I can look back and say, I'm grateful that we were able to overcome that trial so that we can rise up, mature up, help other people as they're walking through their trials. And so I love telling the rawness of the story and the reality of the story, because I know that it helps somebody else. So even though it evokes those emotions again for me again, because that's not even like, we're just talking to like a slice of the story, right? We can't even talk about the whole thing here, but I know that it actually encourages and builds somebody else's faith when I tell the story. These are the things that I walk through. And as I leaned on God and people came alongside me and I trusted him and I wrestled through this thing with God, I was able to come out on the other side and have just a different outlook on life. And do I remember that outlook and think life's precious every minute of every day? No, I just don't. Do my husband and I still have heated fellowship? Absolutely. Like, we're passionate people. We work things out in a heated fashion. Like, that's actually kind of how we are. We're passionate about one another. We're passionate about life. We're passionate about the things that we stand for. So that's how we do it. But what I do love about this is it does model, because I don't think we have great role models in this part of life right now. It does model for our kids and for everyone around us. When life gets hard, even if your marriage gets hard or your closest relationships get hard, instead of ejecting out and going finding somebody else and doing things on your own, working through it and showing other people, we can actually overcome the adversity and still stay together. And we can overcome those trials and those hard things and still be able to work through it and go, yeah, that did suck. But look, this is what it looks like to overcome. Because honestly, I think that's probably one of the most powerful things that I could model for my kids. This is what it looks like to stay in marriage when it's not amazing, but out of maturity, I stay and I stick it out. Now, I'm never advocating stay when there's abuse and things that are not okay. What I am advocating is modeling what it looks like as a mature believer to walk through the hard and come out on the other end saying, yeah, you know what? We did this together. Because that is where I think that's where the beauty comes in.
You're talking about this idea of almost growing through dependence. Because yes, you're depending on people, but ultimately your dependence is on God. And it's that dependence, which kind of flies in the face of the way everything else works in the world. We want to be independent. We want to be the Lone Ranger. We want to be disconnected and somehow figure it all out. But there's this idea here, this through line really, that it's this dependence that ultimately is freeing you. It's freeing you to love God. It's freeing you to love others. And in these last moments, Anita, how would you encourage our listeners to find and discover who they can depend on?
I always kind of thought maybe I didn't understand it. I'll put it in that context. When I'd hear older believers say, man, I just need more. I need God more than I ever did when I was younger. Every day I need him more, the more. So for me, it's more of an awareness. God, I can't do this life alone. I can't do it without my husband. I know that you order our days and I know that you decide when we're born and when we go back to be with you and be in eternity. But man, I don't want to do it without him. I could if I had to, but I don't want to. So in the midst of that, recognizing like the beauty of the relationships that God gives us as gift and appreciating those, but then also leaning on the Lord more, because I am more aware of the times when the Holy Spirit is speaking to me and saying, don't say that. That's not kind. That's not what he needs right now. Meaning my husband, like, you don't need to do that. That's old you. You're not that. So we did go through some cycles and some time frame where we had to look at one another and say, that's the old us. We're not going back there. Remember, we buried that part of our relationship. We're done with that. So that takes time. So recognizing that life takes time to work itself out, and then depending on God in a whole new way that I guess maybe I didn't even really know that I needed, to be honest. I mean, when I'm thinking about it and reflecting on it right now, like, I was close to God before, but now, I mean, it's just even more like I know that I need his presence, his guidance, his love. I need his word. I need community. Right? Like, these days we hear people say like, oh, I have a relationship with God, but I don't go to church. I mean, I'm not shaming anybody in that. But that's not, I don't have a chance to actually grow and mature if my relationship with God is all in my brain.
That's
because experientially, I need to be around other people. I need my husband to tell me, honey, you're out of line. I actually do, right? He needs me to tell him, hey, babe, you're out of line. Like, we need other people in our lives. So we need God. We need people. And it's not because God needs us to need him. Like, he's not that at all. He already designed us. He made us. He knows what we're going to walk through. It's just that the more that I recognize my need for him, the less apt I am to go off on my own and try and figure it all out. And then honestly, mess it up because I'm depending on my own understanding of a situation instead of tapping into the Holy Spirit that's inside of me that says, hey, by the way, this is probably what's going on and let me work it out. So it's not only, okay, so here's another element. I know that I need God more. That's the easy way to put it. And sorry, it wasn't that short and sweet. The other part that I notice is that I can trust God to work in my husband's life.
Right.
Even more so than I can, because I'm like, oh, I see exactly what has to happen and I can work it all out and tell him all about it. And God's like, oh, you're so sweet that you see it that way, but why don't you just let me do that?
Yeah.
And that has been so freeing. It's been so, so freeing, both for him, both for my husband and for me, because now I can just walk in the stuff in the lane that God has for me. Like, I'm a business owner. I'm an entrepreneur. I have clients that I'm taking care of. I'm a homeschooling mom. We've been homeschooling for like 15 years. Like, I have a household to manage. I got a lot going on. I don't need to worry about the stuff that God's working on in my husband's life because I trust God. And the way that I trust him, the way that I prove that I trust him is that I stay out of the way and then God could do the work that only God can do. Because can I just tell you, my husband's like a completely different person than he was 2 years ago. And he was already fun and happy. Like, you would have gotten along amazing with him. He's the kind of personality. He loves everybody. Everybody loves him. Walks into a room. He's super dynamic. Like, they're like, oh my gosh, he's here. He makes friends with everybody super easily.
Yeah.
But the way that we were acting towards one another was not amazing. And so to be in a relationship now with my husband, and he's like, I love you. I love you more every day. And being in a spot where now we've gone back to where we were at when we were dating and like championing each other and seeing the gold in each other and drawing that gold out and be like, that's not who you are. This is what God says. This is who you are. This is really who you are. So when we start backpedaling and walking in the things that we're not supposed to, then we can cheerlead each other and be like, I love you. And I love you enough that in truth, I can say, I see you doing something that's not what God has called you to. And so, man, it's just beautiful, right? Like, and I can celebrate him more as a person that God has made him, but also he can celebrate me more in the way that God has made me. And we don't have to like change each other anymore. We can just let God do that.
Well, and I think that is the beauty of adversity. We don't like it. We don't love going through it, but it has a way of refining us. And
if you let it, let me just
be
clear. If you let it, it will refine you and grow you and mature you. But, let's just be honest. Sometimes either we're not ready to do that or other people don't. And so then it just beats them down.
You've given us a lot to think about. Anita, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Mercy Cast.
Oh, you're so welcome. And hey, I just want to honor you and what you're doing. By doing this podcast, you are reaching so many people and helping them just one episode at a time. So I just want to honor you. And who you are and this vision that God's put on your heart, because I know you're making a difference for the kingdom, and that is really, really powerful and really special. And you're doing that in only the way that you can. So thank you so much for what you're doing every day.